All right, let's dive in. You sent over this entry from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, all about implicit bias. And, I had a feeling, knowing you, that this wouldn't just be about psychology for you. This is going to open up like a whole Pandora's box of questions about, metaphysics, epistemology, the whole works.
Yeah, definitely.
So our mission today is to really, really get into the nitty-gritty of implicit bias, not just what it is, but what it means for how we see the world, how we see ourselves, like a guided tour through all the thought-provoking stuff that comes out of this research, specifically for philosophers. Because, while you are one...
It's amazing how, research in psychology can really shake things up in philosophy. Makes us rethink what we thought we knew about the mind, about knowledge, even about morality.
So here's the plan. First, we'll get clear on what implicit bias even is and how it's measured. Because let's be real, how we measure something can totally change what we think it is.
For sure.
Then the fun part, the philosophy. What are these biases? Like, are they attitudes, beliefs, something weirder?
Right. And then, can we even know about these biases? If they're implicit, like deep down, can we be aware of them? Get ready for some serious mind-bending stuff there.
Yeah.
And finally, we got to tackle the ethics. Are we responsible for biases we don't even know we have? And if so, what can we even do about them? It's going to be a wild ride, but we'll hit the highlights. And hopefully you'll walk away with some, whoa moments.
Yeah.
So, starting simple. What's the core idea behind implicit bias?
So the main point the entry makes is this. People can act on prejudice and stereotypes. But here's the kicker, without actually meaning to. It's different from, the old school view of prejudice, where it's all about, openly held beliefs. Most of the research focuses on biases against groups that face, social stigma. Think race, gender, sexual orientation. They give the example of Frank. He believes in gender equality, truly. But unconsciously, he might, trust feedback from male colleagues more. Or maybe hire a less qualified man over a woman. That disconnect between what he says he believes and what he does, that's what implicit bias is all about. Yeah, the unintentional part really throws a wrench into things. Especially for philosophy, when we're talking about, are we in control of our actions? Are we responsible? So where did this idea of studying implicit bias even come from?
Well, there are two main roots. First, back in the late 20th century, cognitive psychology was really taking off. And they started making this distinction between controlled and automatic processing. Controlled processing, that's your conscious thought. It takes effort. It's slow. You can only do so much at once. But automatic processing, it's fast, often unconscious, and it can handle way more.
Right, like when you first learn to drive, you're thinking about every little thing. But then after a while, you just do it. You don't even realize.
Exactly. And research showed that attitudes, the way we feel about things, can be activated through either pathway, controlled or automatic.
So some of our reactions, they might just be happening on autopilot below the radar.
Right. And then the second big influence, it's the realization that stereotypes, they're everywhere. And they can affect us even if we don't agree with them. Researchers started showing that just knowing about a stereotype could change how we judge people, even if we said we didn't believe it.
Wow.
Yeah. This is all tied to the idea of implicit memory, where past experiences can shape our actions even if we don't remember them. There's a famous definition by Greenwald and Banaji. They said implicit attitudes are, and I'm quoting here, introspectively unidentified or inaccurately identified traces of past experience that mediate favorable or unfavorable feeling, thought, or action towards social objects. Basically, as overt prejudice became less socially acceptable, these biases may have just gone underground. They're still there influencing us, but we're less aware of them.
So it's like they snuck into the basement of our minds, out of sight, but not out of, influence.
Precisely.
But the entry mentions this idea of implicit biases as hidden attitudes has kind of been, revised.
It has. And a big reason is because of how we measure them. You can't just ask someone if they're biased. They might not know, or they might not want to tell you. So researchers had to get creative. They developed indirect measures to get at those thoughts and feelings without relying on self-reports.
Okay, so instead of asking, are you biased, they had to find clever ways to figure it out. What are some of those methods?
One of the early ones was Fasio's sequential priming task. They'd flash a word related to a social group like black, and then another word, positive or negative. And they'd measure how quickly people responded to the second word. The idea being that if you have a negative association with black, you'll be quicker to respond to a negative word.
Makes sense.
But the real game changer was the Implicit Association Test, or IAT, developed by Greenwald, Banaji, and Nosek.
The IAT, yeah, I've heard of that. How did that one work?
It's all about reaction time. People have to quickly categorize words or images, using keys on a computer. So you might have to sort words related to male and career with one key, and words related to female and family with another. Then they switch it up so male goes with family and female with career. The idea is if you have a strong association between male and career, you'll be faster and make fewer mistakes when those are paired together.
Clever. So it's like your brain's wiring gets revealed by how fast you can sort things.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the difference in reaction time between those consistent pairings and the inconsistent ones, that's what suggests implicit bias.
Mm.
But there are other measures too, like variations on sequential priming, semantic priming, the effect misattribution procedure, even second-generation categorization tasks like the GNAT.
So lots of tools in the toolbox. But you mentioned something important earlier. These measures aren't, process pure.
Right, and this is where it gets really interesting philosophically. We have these tools to measure something, but what are we actually measuring? Multinomial models, like the quadruple process model, have shown that it's not just one thing driving IAT scores. It's a mix of things. Automatic association, sure, but also your ability to figure out the right answer, your ability to override those automatic responses, and even just general biases in how you respond. So someone's bias on the IAT, it's an indicator, but it's influenced by a whole bunch of stuff.
So not a simple readout of your unconscious mind, more like a fingerprint, right? It can identify you, but it's not you.
Exactly. A fingerprint is a result of ink and a surface, not a pure capture of your finger. Implicit measures are like that. They aim to reveal biases indirectly, not just capture them directly.
And this complexity, it leads straight into those big philosophical questions, right? Like, what are implicit biases at their core?
Exactly. The entry lays out 5 main theories about this: attitudes, implicit processes, beliefs, traits, and situations. We can start with the idea that they're attitudes, since that's often the first thing people think of.
Okay, so the initial thought is implicit biases, they're just attitudes we're not fully aware of. But I remember the entry makes a point about how psychologists and philosophers, they use attitude differently.
They do. Psychologists, they use it broadly. Like any evaluation or preference towards something, liking or disliking, it doesn't have to be tied to a specific belief, a proposition. But philosophers, they're stricter. Attitudes are propositional, meaning they have a content that can be true or false. Like, I believe that, or I desire that. So most psychological theories about implicit bias, they're using attitude in that broader way.
Got it. And within this broader view of attitudes, there's the concept of dual attitudes. What's that all about?
So early on, psychologists thought, maybe people have 2 sets of attitudes.
Yeah.
One implicit, one explicit. Explicit are the ones you're aware of. You can say what they are. Implicit are the ones you're either unaware of or maybe just don't want to admit to them.
Interesting.
Right. The evidence for this was stuff like people being totally surprised by their IAT results, like, wait, that's not what I believe. And the fact that implicit and explicit measures often don't correlate well. So it seems like they might be measuring different things. So the key point here is we might have both conscious and unconscious evaluations, and they don't always match up.
That's tricky. But the entry also asks, are we really unaware of those implicit biases? And in what way? Unaware of the feeling, the content of the thought.
Yeah, if there's some awareness, then the unconscious part gets messy, and that's where some philosophers have come in with new interpretations of what dual could mean. They say maybe implicit measures are picking up on a different kind of attitude, one that's more about action, like linking mental pictures directly to how you act.
This sounds like Gendler's A-leaf idea. Can you unpack that a bit?
Gendler, she says, a-leaf is different from belief. It's this tight bundle of representation, affect, and behavior. You see something, you feel something, and it makes you want to act a certain way, all bundled together. So seeing someone from a certain group might trigger this automatic X is dangerous. Avoid A-leaf, even if you consciously believe otherwise. A-leafs, they're associative, automatic, they don't care about logic, they're full of emotion, and they make you do things. She argues that A-leafs explain why we sometimes do things that don't match our beliefs, like implicit bias.
So it's like a gut reaction that overrides your brain, even if your brain knows better. But the entry mentions some criticisms of this A-leaf idea, right?
Oh, yeah. Some say it's too broad. They question whether everything Gendler lumps into A-leaf is really the same kind of mental state. Phobias, fiction, habits, implicit bias, are they really all driven by the same thing? Others propose alternatives, like Brownstein and Madva. They talk about implicit attitudes in terms of like feature, tension, behavior, alleviation. They agree it's about action, but say these attitudes can be updated with new information, which is different from Gendler's A-leafs, which are harder to change. They also point out that these attitudes don't care about logic. They're not as rich as beliefs. Levy's patchy endorsements also kind of fits in here with the idea that our mental states can be fragmented.
So a lot of debate about whether these are truly different dual attitudes or just different sides of the same coin.
Right.
What about the idea that there's just one attitude, but it gets expressed in different ways?
That's where models like Modi and MCM come in. They say there's just one underlying attitude. But implicit and explicit measures, they just capture different aspects of it. They argue that implicit measures, they often put you in a situation where you don't have time to think things through. So your true attitude comes out, the automatic one. But explicit measures, you have more control. You can try to be more socially acceptable, or you can align your answers with your conscious beliefs.
So it's like the same person, but under different lighting.
Exactly. Like a single light source can look different depending on what it hits, right? The underlying attitude is there, but how it shows up depends on the context.
Fascinating. Now, the entry also talks about implicit biases as implicit processes. How's that different from saying they're attitudes?
Theories like the reflective impulsive model, RIM, and the APE model, they shift the focus. They say it's not about the attitude itself, but about how you get to the response. They make a big distinction between associative processes, which are fast and based on connections you've learned, and propositional processes, which are slower and more about logic and truth.
Right.
So they argue that implicit measures mostly tap into those associative networks. Like, black is linked to danger in your mind because of all the things you've been exposed to. While explicit measures, they capture the outcome of your conscious reasoning.
So it's not that you have an unconscious attitude, it's that your brain just makes these quick connections.
Exactly. Your brain is a network, and sometimes certain pathways are just more well-trodden than others. Doesn't necessarily mean that's what you believe, it's just how your brain is wired.
That's a subtle but important distinction. What about the idea that implicit biases are actually just beliefs?
Some researchers and philosophers argue that we don't need anything fancy like beliefs or implicit processes. Our good old-fashioned notion of belief can do the job.
Really?
Yeah. The contradictory belief view says that both implicit and explicit measures are tapping into beliefs, but we can hold different, even conflicting beliefs that get activated in different situations. It's like our belief system is fragmented. So maybe when you act in a biased way, it's not some hidden attitude. It's an actual belief you have, even if you don't consciously endorse it.
So, like, deep down, you might actually believe something, even if you'd never say it out loud.
Exactly. There's a psychologist, Hauer, who has this propositional model. He says implicit measures capture beliefs based on how quickly they form and the fact that people are often aware of the ideas being tested. He even argues that all learning is based on propositions, which is a big claim.
Whoa, so even automatic biases, they're all about beliefs in the end. What other belief-based theories are there?
Well, there's the idea of generic beliefs or schemas. These are like culturally shared bundles of concepts and beliefs we use to understand the world. Some argue these schemas can be coldly cognitive, meaning they're not about emotions, they're just tools for categorizing people. Yeah, and then there's work on striking property generics in philosophy of language, like the statement, pit bulls maul children. These are generalizations, often based on a few extreme cases, that can reinforce stereotypes. Beagley connects this to schemas, showing how language can shape our implicit associations. And then there's a really interesting view called Spinozan belief fixation.
Spinozan belief fixation. That sounds intense.
It is. They argue that we automatically believe everything we encounter, at least for a moment. Unlike the Cartesian view where we evaluate before believing, this explains how we can hold contradictory beliefs, because you have to believe something in order to reject it.
That's a wild thought. So, like, our brains are just belief machines, constantly churning.
Right. But it's controversial. The debate hinges on how implicit measures respond to different interventions. If they're about beliefs, then logic and persuasion should work. But if it's just associations, then repetition and reinforcement should be more effective.
Makes sense. So many different ways to think about these biases. Now, what about the idea that they're like traits?
In psychology, trait means something stable over time across situations. And research shows implicit biases can change. They're more context dependent. But philosophers, they use trait differently, like in dispositional theories of mind, where beliefs are tendencies to act or feel a certain way.
Okay.
So Spitzgobel, he says people with implicit bias are like in-between believers. They don't fully endorse the stereotype, but they act in a way that partially matches it.
So even if you say you believe in equality, if you act differently, you're not a full-fledged believer in that sense.
Right. And then there's Macheri. He says implicit measures don't capture the whole attitude, they just reflect elements of it, like preferences that are based on feelings, associations, or beliefs. Different measures might pick up on different elements, which explains why they don't always correlate. And he rejects the whole idea of a sharp division between implicit and explicit attitudes.
So it's more like a spectrum. Different measures are like looking through different filters, but it's all part of the same complex picture.
Yeah, exactly. But there are challenges for trait-based views too, like do traits really explain behavior or just describe it? And how do you avoid circularity, where you define a trait by behaviors and then use that trait to predict the same behaviors?
Good points. Now, all of these views focus on the individual mind. But the last category is super interesting, the idea that implicit bias is actually about the situation we're in.
Right. The bias of crowds, modeled by Payne and his colleagues, they say implicit bias is less about the person and more about the context. Like, think about doing the wave at a game. Whether you stand up depends more on where you are in the stadium than how much you love the team.
That's a good analogy.
So they're saying things like, the level of segregation in your neighborhood might predict your implicit racial bias better than your personal beliefs.
So the bias isn't in our heads, it's in the world around us.
In a way, yes. It explains why we see consistent patterns of bias at a group level, even if individuals vary. But the challenge for this view is explaining how those situational factors actually work. Like, how does segregation affect your mind to create bias? They talk about accessibility of concepts, but it's not clear what that means exactly.
It makes you wonder, if we change the situation, do we change the bias? Big questions. Okay, so we've got all these different views on what implicit biases are. Now, how do we even know about them? And what does that knowledge or lack of it tell us about ourselves? This is where the philosophy gets really deep, right?
Yeah, this is where it gets epistemological. The entry highlights three main areas: self-knowledge of biases, skepticism about our own minds, and those tricky ethical epistemic dilemmas.
Starting with self-knowledge. Are we aware of our biases, and to what extent? And remember the entry pointing out that unconscious can mean a lot of things.
Right. When we say a bias is unconscious, it could mean you don't feel it, you don't know the specific content of the biased thought, you're unaware of where it came from, or you don't realize it's affecting your actions. Garonsky and others have argued that we're often unaware of the source and impact of our biases, but we might be aware of the content.
Interesting. So, you might know you have a bias against a certain group, but you don't realize where you got it from or how it's making you act differently.
Exactly. And some of the evidence for this comes from bogus pipeline experiments, where they make people think their true attitudes can be detected. And in those cases, implicit and explicit measures line up better. Like, people are more honest when they think they can't hide it. And other studies have found that people are actually pretty good at predicting their own IAT scores, regardless of how much they know about the test.
So maybe we have more access to our biases than we think. But the big question is, how do we become aware? Introspection, observing our own behavior.
Exactly. And depending on how that awareness arises, it might not count as self-knowledge in the philosophical sense. If we're just inferring our biases from our actions, well, are those inferences reliable? Especially if we're generally bad at knowing our own minds, as some philosophers like Saul argue.
Which brings us to the skepticism part. The entry talks about two main types of skepticism related to implicit bias. First, skepticism about our own perceptions.
Yeah, there's some pretty unsettling research in this area, like Payne's study in 2001, where they showed that flashing black faces subliminally made people identify guns faster. And they were more likely to mistake a tool for a gun.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. This and other research showing how beliefs can affect perception have made philosophers like Siegel worried. They argue that implicit bias can create a feedback loop. You perceive someone as threatening because of your bias, and then you use that perception to justify your bias. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy.
That's scary.
It is. But the severity of the problem depends on how the bias affects perception. Cognitive penetration, where the bias actually changes what you see, that's the worst-case scenario. Perceptual bypass, where the bias makes you interpret things differently without changing the perception itself, that's still bad, but maybe not as bad. But then there's disowned behavior, where you recognize the error and correct it.
So the question is, are we seeing the world differently because of our biases? Or just interpreting it differently?
Exactly. And the research is still trying to figure that out. But the big takeaway is, our biases might be shaping the very information we use to form beliefs.
And then there's an even broader form of skepticism, doubting our ability to know anything at all.
Saul calls it bias-related doubt. He argues that implicit bias research shows that our judgments aren't always rational. They're influenced by things we're not aware of, things we can't control, so maybe our judgments are flawed all the time. Grading papers, hiring people, making decisions, who knows what biases are creeping in. And then there's Fricker's work on epistemic injustice, where we discount the testimony of people from marginalized groups. Implicit bias can make this even worse.
It's like once you see the potential for bias, it's everywhere.
Right. And unlike, say, making a mistake in probabilistic reasoning, the influence of implicit bias is potentially pervasive. It makes you question whether you can trust your own mind. Saul's worried about unreflective habits and intuitions. He says, if they can be biased, how can we trust them to lead us to knowledge?
It's a pretty bleak outlook. But the entry does mention some philosophers who defend those unreflective habits.
They do. They argue that some habits, especially those based on expertise, are reliable sources of knowledge. It's a debate about when our automatic responses are trustworthy and when they're likely to lead us astray.
Big questions about what it means to know something. And all of this leads to those ethical epistemic dilemmas.
Right. Gendler and Egan, they both talk about this tension between being fair and being accurate. Gendler says if we live in a world shaped by social categories, but we reject those categories ethically, we're stuck. We either ignore potentially useful information about those categories, which makes our knowledge worse, or we use that information and risk reinforcing those categories, which is ethically problematic. She calls this forbidden base rates, like knowing that a certain group is statistically more likely to do something, even if you know it's unfair to judge individuals based on that.
So you're damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. Egan suggests that sometimes we might just have to sacrifice some accuracy for the sake of ethics. But other philosophers, like Mugg, Beagley, and Madhva, they push back on this. They argue that the problem isn't the knowledge itself, it's how accessible it is. We need strategies to control when those thoughts come up. Madhva connects this to moral encroachment, the idea that moral considerations can actually change what we're justified in believing.
So it's a messy tangle of our minds, our values, and our desire to understand the world. It's not easy being a knower.
Definitely not.
Okay, now let's get to the ethics. If we have these biases, even if we don't mean to, are we responsible? And can we change?
This is where the philosophy gets practical. The entry talks about two main questions: moral responsibility and interventions. Let's start with responsibility.
All right, so under what conditions are we to blame for our implicit biases? And the entry makes a distinction between being responsible for having the bias and being responsible for what it causes you to do.
Right. And there's also the difference between being responsible, meaning blameworthy, and holding someone responsible, like punishing them. We're focusing on blameworthiness here.
Good clarification.
So there are three main approaches: arguments from awareness, arguments from control, and deep self theories. Let's start with awareness. It seems intuitive that if you're not aware of something, you can't be blamed for it, right?
Yeah, like if you accidentally trip someone because you didn't see them, it's not your fault.
Exactly. And Saul argues that this applies to implicit bias. Folk psychology backs this up. We tend to blame people less for things they didn't realize they were doing. But what about that content awareness we talked about earlier? If you're aware of the bias itself, but not how it's affecting you, does that change things?
Good question.
Holroyd argues that focusing too much on impact awareness can lead to a slippery slope. We're often unaware of the things that influence us. Are we not responsible for anything then? Others say lack of impact awareness doesn't always get you off the hook. Like if you're in a bad mood and snap at someone, you might not be fully aware of how your mood is affecting you, but you're still responsible for being rude.
Right. You can't just blame it on your bad mood all the time.
Exactly. And then there's the argument that responsibility depends on what you should know. Like if you're in a position where implicit bias can cause harm, you have a responsibility to learn about it and try to mitigate it.
So, like, a doctor should know about medical biases, a teacher should know about educational biases, that kind of thing.
Right. And as our understanding of implicit bias grows, so does our responsibility to address it. Then there's Levy, who argues that to be morally responsible for an attitude, it has to be integrated with your other beliefs and values. He says implicit attitudes often aren't integrated in this way, so we're not directly responsible for them.
So awareness is key, but it's not simple. What about the arguments based on control?
The idea here is that implicit processes are less controlled. They're automatic. And there's the rebound effect, where trying to suppress a bias can make it stronger. So how can we be responsible for something we can't control? Some even argue that these biases aren't even our own, they just reflect what we've been exposed to. But philosophers have questioned whether this lack of control really gets us off the hook.
So, like, even if it's a reflex, are we still responsible for it?
Right. One view is the reasons responsiveness view. It says control, in the moral sense, means being able to respond to reasons. So are automatic behaviors reasons responsive? Some say yes, pointing to things like ecological control, where past choices shape even our automatic responses. Others distinguish between automaticity and automatisms, arguing that we can be responsible for things that became automatic through practice and monitoring. And some argue that implicit attitudes might not even be fully automatic since they can change.
So maybe there's more control than we think. What about the distinction between direct and indirect control?
Yeah, Holroyd, Livy, and Mandelbaum, they point out that we're often held responsible for things we don't directly control, like learning a skill or forming a belief. So the question is, can we indirectly control our implicit biases through effort and strategies? Which brings us to interventions.
Right, if you can change it, maybe you're responsible for not changing it. What about the deep self theories?
Those shift the focus away from control and awareness. They ask, does the action or attitude reflect who you really are, your deepest values and desires? Smith argues that implicit biases can sometimes come from rational judgments, even if they conflict with your conscious beliefs. Others focus on cares, your deepest motivations and emotions. The question is, do your biases match your cares?
So even if you don't act on a bias, if it reflects your true self, you might still be blameworthy.
Right. And then there are variantist views where you're responsible even if the bias doesn't reflect your deep self. It's about violating moral duties or the harm you cause. They argue that our whole concept of responsibility needs to be rethought because of implicit bias.
Wow, so much to think about just with responsibility. Now, what about actually changing these biases? Can we even do that?
This is where applied ethics comes in. It's about practical strategies. And there's a lot of interest from policymakers because of anti-discrimination efforts. But it's important to note that the effectiveness of a lot of these strategies is still unclear. Research is ongoing.
Okay, so what are some of the strategies?
They divide them into change-based and control-based. Change-based try to actually change the underlying associations, things like intergroup contact, where positive interactions with people from different groups can reduce bias, or approach training, where you practice negating stereotypes and affirming counter-stereotypes. There's also evaluative conditioning, where you pair the target group with positive things, and counter-stereotype exposure, where you expose people to examples that challenge the stereotype.
So like retraining your brain to make different associations.
Exactly. Control-based interventions, they focus on managing the effects of the bias. You learn to recognize when it's happening and override it. Things like implementation intentions, where you make if-then plans to deal with situations where bias might pop up, or noticing cues for control, like feeling uncomfortable or anxious, which might signal that your bias is activated. And priming egalitarian goals or positive moods has also been shown to help.
So it's like learning to be a bias buster. You can't always prevent it, but you can learn to manage it.
Exactly. But there are concerns about these interventions, like, do they last? Can they be used in the real world? And will focusing on individual change distract us from fixing the bigger systemic problems? It's an ongoing area of research. But there is some optimism that these interventions, combined with other efforts, can make a difference.
It's good to know people are working on it. Now, the entry also mentions some criticisms of implicit bias research, people pushing back against the whole idea.
Right. There have been some strong critiques. Some worry about hype, that the research is being overblown and doesn't actually explain as much as people say. Others argue that explicit bias is still the bigger problem. And there's the issue of whether implicit measures actually predict behavior. And finally, there's the structuralist critique, which says focusing on individual bias ignores the larger systems of inequality.
Let's touch on each of those. The hype critique. Is there too much excitement around implicit bias?
Some critics say yes. They argue that the focus on implicit bias has overshadowed other factors, and that it's being used to explain things it can't really explain. They worry that this will lead to disillusionment and distrust in the research. It's a call to be cautious and not overstate the findings.
Makes sense. What about explicit bias? Some say it's still the main driver of discrimination.
Right. Critics like Hermanson and Singal point out that explicit prejudice is still a huge problem. They argue that focusing on implicit bias distracts from addressing the more blatant forms of discrimination. And they're right, explicit bias is a serious issue. But the philosophical interest in implicit bias comes from the fact that it affects even those who reject prejudice. It shows how insidious bias can be.
It's like, even if we have good intentions, our minds can still be working against us.
Exactly. And the relationship between implicit and explicit bias is complex. They can probably influence each other. It's important to remember that there's no single agreed-upon definition of implicit, and it's often confused with unconscious, which is also a tricky concept. And research shows that implicit measures, while distinct from explicit attitudes, aren't totally unrelated to them.
And then there's the question of whether implicit measures actually predict how people act.
Yeah, this is a big one. Meta-analyses have found correlations between implicit measures and behavior, but they're small to medium-sized. Critics like Oswald and Buckwalter say this means they're not good predictors. But social psychologists point out that predicting behavior is hard. Attitudes are just one factor among many, and correlations of that size are common in social science. The fact that they consistently find some correlation is actually pretty good. The debate is about how to interpret those findings.
So the jury's still out on how much implicit bias actually drives our actions?
Right, and then there's the structuralist critique.
Right, the argument that focusing on individual bias misses the bigger picture.